All letters have an optimum size when it comes to the size of the tip or the nib. Understanding how to build a guideline or a grid sheet for this is really important. So one of the things we're going to look at is we're going to compare a soft brush, which I tend to refer to as a spongy tip brush. Most people call this a felt tip brush. I call it a spongy tip brush because in some instances it's not actually felt. And I refer to these as, these are generally called bristle tip brushes. I refer to them as filamented brushes because I like to make the distinction between real hair and synthetic filaments. So if you look at these two tools, you can see immediately that the soft brush or the spongy tip brush is shorter and wider at the base than the bristled brush or the filamented brush. The filamented brush is longer in its filaments or hairs, if you want to call it that, but the base is also a little bit narrower, and these will dramatically affect how large a letter you can write. So I'm going to start with the soft brush. The way to test this is to hold it on its tip and see what the thinnest stroke is. Now notice I'm slowly moving my arm downward so the arm is flatter. I'm not pressing on the tip. So these are all without pressure. Next, I'm going to do the same exercise with pressure. So I know that I don't really want to get this wide because I can damage the tool. I might want to get to about here. So that tells me that the best stroke for this brush is roughly that. I can do it larger if I wanted to, but doing it at an angle at this height would always be a problem because you'd have to bend your wrist like that, which is really bad for you. So always try to keep the wrist in a comfortable position. When compared to the bristle tip brush, what we see is a much greater variety of line. And we see the line breaking up, which adds charm to the letter. Now this is holding the tool on its side. You can also hold the tool on top and apply pressure to the bristles in a vertical downward fashion. Ideally, you don't want to go more than go more than another half of the width of this. So this is clearly too wide. And I don't know if you can see how the tip has done that. It's feathered. So the way that you get this back together is you press, you jiggle, you twist and turn and pull up and out, and it comes back to a really nice point. So this then tells us how high our letters can be. So that's a pretty good size if you're holding the tool on its side. However, if you want to hold the tool on its top, that's the widest you would go. So we'll rule some guidelines up based on these principles, and we'll get on with the letters. All calligraphy, when you're initially starting off, relies on the ability to produce guidelines. The guidelines are really important as a guide so that you actually get the letters at the correct height consistently. So there are different ways to produce guidelines. I'm going to start off with the simplest method, which is using two set squares or triangles. What I tend to do is line them up to the edge of the page, run the guideline along there, one line along there. So let's just line that up again. And from that single line, we can build the guideline. So I'm going to start with the calligraphy 1 marker with the 5 on the line, touch, 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 touch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 4 below. 2, 3, and 4. Notice how slowly I'm doing this. I'm really taking my time because I want the full width of the marker. So that tells me, so if I'm doing italic, I usually do italic at 4. You can do it at 5 or 6. You could even do it at 8. 4 and 4 is the baseline, X height, ascender. Cap height is normally 6 and your descender is normally 4 from the bottom. So I'm going to rule a line along the edge so that the marker is holding the page in place as well. So sorry, the triangle is holding the page in place as well. And I'm going to adjust that to the edge. Ascender. I tend to dash in a cap height rather than have a solid line. X height and descender line. So I've essentially created a parallel motion ruler by holding this in place. It's also the same thing that T-square will do. So this gives us our ascender, cap, waist, or X height, baseline, and descender line. Now, once you've done that, you've basically created a grid, a series of lines that make up either your grid or your guidelines. And the next thing is to use paper on top of it so you can see through the lines. So what I would then do, this is a separate sheet of paper, I would take a blank piece of paper and I would copy that up. Let's do it on the other side, as I'm right-handed. Put this down. Rule an edge up. So let's do 2. Make sure the edge is to the edge of the page. And then I always give myself a little extra space at the top. So we start here, we have ascender, cap, waist, base, and then I do an extra 4, which is the X height. Then we have cap, waist or X height, baseline, and descender. Line this up to the edge. Rule the lines accordingly. Notice I'm keeping the pencil vertical as well. I'm just double checking to see if that's not shifted. Now, what I then do is I go in a little bit. So I know this is a space. This is the ascender and cap height. And that's your X and your descender. So I would go in and do some little additional lines. So this tells me this is 1. This is your cap height. And so I generally mark this off because I know that's the space I'm going to work in. So that's the X height, cap, ascender, descender, baseline. So I find it useful to have these little markings onto the sheets because it's easier to find them when you are looking at the sheet through another sheet of paper. So once you put this down, this becomes slightly confusing. And that's how I rule up for the broad edge markers. Now, I'm just going to have a quick look at the scroll and brush marker, preferably the scroll side. So we know that we can do the same thing here because we have essentially the 3.5 of the markers is the same size as the scroll. So we can rule up the scroll based on the same principle. However, if I'm ruling up for a scroll, I tend to only use a 3.5 solid marker. That way you can actually see what you're doing. This is a little bit confusing, and you can have a tendency to miss the line a little. So this has given us the correct height for a 4, and for 3.5 it's 6, and a scroll at 6. So now that we've looked at how to rule up for a straight tool, for a broad edge tool, let's look at how this principle works for a brush. It's the same sort of principle. So I'm going to get a standard size brush. So let's take a brushable. And from the brushable, we know that that's your sort of average stroke. You don't really want a stroke that big because you have to keep pressing, which means it's going to hurt your hand. So if we know that that's your average stroke, that's basically going to be your X height. So let's write a letter and see how it feels. Okay, so I know that the letter prefers to be slightly bigger than that, so that would be my X height for a vertical letter. However, if the letter is going to be on its side, that's a really good size for the X height. So they're not that different, they're just one mark different from each other. Now, that goes for all of your brush pens. So let's look at some fine and extra fine brush pens. I always put the cap on the back because my hands are large, and I always tend to line it up to the label. That way it's not that distracting. So let's test this. That's the fine, and that is the extra fine. So let's see. One, two, three, four. So if we're not going to press very hard, 3, 4. That's a nice size. This also has to, working out the size of this also has to do with how fine the hairline is, because you want that relationship to be kept. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I would make this just a little bit larger. However, if you're holding the tool like this, you're sort of restricted to the amount of vertical movement you have with the tool, because this hold is a real issue for dexterity and for producing a longer line. So I know I can do that. This only really allows you that. And beyond there and there, beyond that central column, that central bit here, you're really pushing the fingers up and back. So that gives us a really good sense of how to rule up for a soft or a spongy tip tool or a felt tip tool. Now, let's take that same principle and apply it to the bristle or filamented tips. So I'm going to use a Fude 8. So I know that a Fude 8 will produce that letter quite easily. Its preference is usually about there. And if we're writing on its side, that's the height that I would probably go for this letter. So how does that relate to the size of the bristles? So it's roughly about 5, 4.5 to 4 to 5. If we take a slightly larger brush pen, like a cambio, so one of the cambio tambiens, we can see that from an upright perspective, either of those will do, and from the side, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the rule of thumb is generally between 4 and 5. Or maybe 4.5 if you really wanted to sort of pick at it. There are exceptions to the rule in that you have tools like the 55 where the tip bends much more readily. And so you have a really nice contrast between the hairlines and the heavy strokes. And that's quite big. So that gives us a massive 5. Let's try it on its side. So we see the comfort zone for the 55 is actually 3. So understanding how to build your grid is really important. Now, once you've understood how the grid works, you might decide to change the way that you apply writing so that it's more of a playful structure rather than something that is rigidly confined to 2 lines, or quadrilinear if you're using uppercase and lowercase, which is 4 lines, or bilinear if you're using 2 lines. So what I've done here is I'm using the baseline to move down relative to the baseline or up relative to the baseline. But I'm keeping a check on my angles so that they relate to each other. And that's how I rule up a sheet.